Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for FSK from Home lecture series. I am Margot Copera, Public Programs Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today and those who have donated to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge. This year, we have raised over $2,000. That is incredible, and we thank you so much for your support. It really does make a huge impact on all of our work. If you would like to donate to this program, check out the chat for the donation link that will be placed in there shortly. This year for our FSK seasons, we have pulled back the curtain on our collections. Connect with MCHC staff and our colleagues as they reveal the stories behind the objects we preserve, interpret, and display. Today, my colleague, Allison Tolman, MCHC Vice President of Collections and Interpretation, welcomes our guest and invites him to discuss his work and talents in costume and textiles. Thank you, Allison, for hosting this conversation today.
Thank you, Margot. So I am delighted to be here with you all today to talk about the fascinating project that actually started years ago. The Tench Tilghman uniform has long been displayed at MCHC in our Inventing a Nation gallery. It's incredibly rare extant uniform, and we struggled with how to show it, to make it accessible to visitors, to try and increase preservation standards so that we can keep it for generations to come. The line between preservation and accessibility is one we are often walking. Trying to find creative solutions that give us the best accessibility is one way we try to do that. So this is how we came up with the idea of creating a uniform, reproduction uniform, one we can display and use to tell the story of Tench Tilghman while being able to preserve the original and keep it from the dangers of prolonged display. We wanted to be able to have a new uniform as accurate and close as to the original as possible. And that is where Neal comes in. Hi, Neal.
How are you?
Neal Hurst is an associate curator of costume and textiles at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and he runs his own business, Neal Hurst Tailor, where he reproduces the highest quality reproduction garments for living historians, historic sites, and museums. He earned his Master of Arts and Sciences from the Winter program in Material Culture at the University of Delaware. His bachelor's is from the College of William and Mary, and he had a 7-year apprenticeship in the Department of Historic Trades at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, where he honed his expertise in recreating historic garments. Before his current role, he was the assistant curator at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. So basically, to all of you Rev War uniform military fans out there, Neal Hurst is the guy you want to grab a drink with. Welcome, Neal.
How are you doing, Allison?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine.
So before we dive into the Tench Tilghman project, I'd like you to tell me, how did you get into historic tailoring?
Well, it's funny because it started as a fascination a long time ago, and probably sometime in middle school when a good friend of mine who are at the time and still are, history buffs, went to this living history event in just outside of Philadelphia. And it was pouring, and the event was sort of canceled, but they had moved it underneath these sort of picnic pavilions, Civil War event. And so we, at that point, ended up joining that unit, and we started buying things and building our uniforms and such. But one of the things that we were kind of like perplexed with is, we have all these books about material culture from that period, but the uniforms that we were buying off the rack didn't look like what we were seeing in museums or in books. So that kind of propelled us forward into kind of understanding more about what how these uniforms are put together, the materials, patterns. And that sort of kind of started me on that trajectory of learning more and more about uniforms, and then ultimately recreating them for individuals.
So basically, you saw that something was not quite right, and you had to figure out.
It is a little obsessive compulsive. So,
no, that sounds like a historian. Is what that sounds like. That's really, really interesting. So, as far as recreating historic clothing, what is your favorite era or type of clothing that you love to work on?
Yeah, I've done a huge array of things at this point. I've been very, very lucky to recreate things from as early as the 17th century up through, in fact, the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I did a really interesting project recreating General George Patton's Green Hornet, which was his sort of his design for the American Tank Corps, which was kind of avant-garde slightly, but so have had a long interest in various different periods, but I do prefer making sort of 18th century menswear. That's sort of where my my love is, and sort of remains if I can do it.
Yeah, sure. Working at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, that seems perfect fit.
Yes. Yeah, we have a wonderful collection here. It goes up to 1840 though, so we do have a great collection that it goes well beyond the colonial period though.
Of course. So what is the most finicky thing when you have to replicate when you're creating historic pieces?
Some of the things that's really tricky is fabrics. Fabric itself is tough. We do not have the amount of textiles or the quality of textiles that our ancestors had, let alone 50 years ago versus 250 years ago. So that is really tricky. I think we came pretty close to the Tilghman uniform, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And patterning is tough too, because the garments as a tailor, the objects start flat, but they're never flat on the body. So it's a matter of bringing that shape up into a three-dimensional form. So trying to then take a three-dimensional form and making it flat or as flat as we can to take a pattern off of it is pretty tricky. So some areas are fairly easy, like the center front, the hem and such. But once you start getting up into the arm's eye, where it does curve around the body, it can be fairly tricky to create that pattern and try to make it as accurate as possible, because you can take as many measurements you want, but you're still trying to keep that proportion that whoever that tailor was 250 years ago was able to create to fit, whether it's Tench Tilghman or George Washington or Lafayette, whoever it might be, fit that specific body.
Yeah, it's interesting when I have to give a fashion history tour. What you're talking about, it comes up so often because especially when talking about this time period, it was an investment. Like the textiles were an investment, and now in a fast fashion world, it's not something, unless you're a historian, that you can really relate to, like dedicating a portion to investing in textiles and expecting them to last beyond the first wearer.
Absolutely.
That's just not something that you have now, and finding those textiles can be tricky. And well, with tailored fits, it's not something that's often done today either.
Yeah, absolutely. The fabric is the expense of this garment, whether we talk about Tench Tilghman's uniform or any of the clothing that you find, really prior to the early part of the 19th century. As you said, Allison, the textile is going to be the most expensive part. What they're paying the tailor is really a pittance, or the mantua maker or the milliner or whatever it might be. It's very little in comparison to what they're going to invest in terms of the material.
Yeah. So getting back to your apprenticeship, you had a 7-year apprenticeship where you learned historic techniques.
Yep.
Just one more sort of background. When you're recreating historic techniques, like what was the most finicky thing that you learned how to do that was like historic and you were like, man, there's easier ways to do this now? Because obviously we're talking sewing machine here, but
Sure.
Historic techniques, which was the most difficult?
It's I think the biggest thing is the order of assembly, how these garments are put together. So most of us today who have any sewing knowledge, sort of understand how to put together a garment with a sewing machine, but the machine can only do it one way, whereas the hand is doing it oftentimes in sort of multiple ways, where you're doing multiple things with a single stitch, and it's just something that a machine can't handle because it gets bulky, or it just can't handle it that way. So
Sure.
learning sort of the order of how things are put together, which is quite backwards compared to how modern sewing is done, is pretty challenging. The stitches themselves are fairly, I mean, they're really unchanged. They're and learning to where certain stitches go and where certain stitches don't go, because that also is time, for
Sure.
the individual in the 18th century. So knowing where to put the back stitch versus a running stitch, versus a buttonhole or a blanket stitch, or whatever it might be, is helpful, particularly when you're making a garment that's completely hand sewn, because you don't have that luxury of the sewing machine. So the reality is that the sewing machine, if we're making something that's a sort of a combination of machine sewn and hand sewn, really the sewing machine can only do the long seam. It certainly does save time, but it can't put a lining in like a lining was set in the 18th century. It can't do a buttonhole like a buttonhole was done in the 18th century. So it does save time when recreating things. But when in my apprenticeship, though, we did everything by hand. So yeah, and it also helps to learn a little bit about the division of labor, within these tailor shops in the period, because there's different people who are doing different things.
Of course. And you get to do it all.
Well, our shop was pretty small. During my apprenticeship, it was only 2 of us. So we did do divider labor. We did divider labor a little bit, but in many cases, it was sort of a one-man show in terms of start to finish, because a lot of those things we're trying to learn things for the apprenticeship to, progress through it. And so in order to do that, some of those things had to be done, solely by yourself, which in the period would not be completely accurate.
Right. But that 7-year apprenticeship has led you to be able to create some really amazing pieces like our Tench Tilghman repro.
Yeah.
So let's talk. I'll give a very brief background on Tench Tilghman, just because we're talking a lot about him. I want to give just a brief. So Tench Tilghman was born in Talbot County, Maryland, actually on Christmas Day. George Washington's longest serving aide-de-camp. He began his military career in 1775 as a lieutenant in the Pennsylvania Light Infantry Company. That same year, the Continental Congress appointed him as secretary of a commission to form a treaty with the Six Nations Confederacy. When Congress declared independence in 1776, Tilghman, now a captain, and his regiment joined the Continental Army. In August of 76, he volunteered to be George Washington's aide-de-camp and served in that role until 1781. Tilghman's fluency in French was valuable to Washington as he could interpret written commands between US and French commanders. Following the Battle of Yorktown, Washington selected Tilghman, now a lieutenant colonel, to deliver the British Articles of Capitulation to Congress in Philadelphia. Tench Tilghman unfortunately dies a few years later in 1786. So that is everyone's very brief background on Tench Tilghman. So let's dive into the repro itself. Neal, when you started your work, you came to visit us here at MCHC in our fashion archives to start the work of documenting and patterning the original. So you've got the uniform in front of you.
Yep.
What do you do first? What is
Well,
that?
for me, the first thing for me is always just kind of take a survey, take a look at the garment. What's the condition like? Is something I always note first. Is it pretty fragile? What pieces are there? What pieces aren't there? In our case, the waistcoat is missing from the Tilghman uniform.
Yep.
Maybe still out there. We don't know. So looking at condition and then sort of beginning to figure out what my approach is going to be to pattern the garment as best as possible. I generally take a ton of photographs, and the photographs themselves are just to help me in the construction process, and to document things, obviously, but it has to be kind of systematic. That way I don't take photos that I don't know what they are. I mean, I could generally figure them out, but so in my case, there was quite a bit of tracing for the center front and the lapels that I've done, because I find that is far more accurate than measuring. And then setting up a sort of method in which I measure from the front up through the arm's eye to create that sort of egg shape that is the armscye itself. The Tilghman uniform is pretty straightforward. It's very plain, and I'll show some photos here in a few moments of the actual original, but fairly tall gentleman, kind of a long body in the coat, narrow in the chest. It's kind of the typical stature that we find for most 18th century coats, and for a guy of his age at that point. So the coat was pretty straightforward. There was nothing too tricky about the coat. Some surprises, and like I said, I can talk about those in a few moments. I just include some of those images in my slides. And then the other piece that we do have from the Tilghman uniform is his breeches. And the breeches were compromised a little bit in the fact that they were relined at some point. So somebody within at some point in the history of the Tilghman uniform, they definitely, the uniform was worn by somebody. Whether it was fancy dress or for something else, I don't know, and haven't really found any evidence for it. But the breeches were fully relined and the pocket bags were relined. So there was some kind of messing around with the breeches there.
Neal, just for those who are attending who may not be familiar with fancy dress.
Sure.
We're talking about costuming.
Yes.
Something happened, especially about 100 years after the Revolutionary War.
Absolutely.
Taking the 18th century style and updating it. Could you just a brief?
Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, it was very, very popular. Particularly around the American Centennial in 1876, to sort of break into your closet and bring out great grandmothers or great great grandfathers, stuff, and wear it for fancy dress occasions, whether it's to celebrate the centennial of the United States. And so oftentimes when that happened, things then kind of got updated a little bit for better or for worse.
Yeah, we have seen many 18th century dresses that were sort of Frankenstein to have like a bustle or like more interest in the back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's all kinds of things that are done, and again, it goes back to the sort of investment in textiles too, and also I think it attests to the quality of these textiles, that they're able to pull them out 100 years later and they're still wearable.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's true. We have a quilted silk petticoat in our collection that in the 1920s someone made into a cape. So
That's amazing.
we have the dress, and then we're like, oh, here's the petticoat. Oh no, this is a cape now. But I mean, goes to show you that textiles did last. So you saw in the pants something that showed you that this was remade, which is we often find.
Yeah, not, it doesn't surprise me at all. So the breeches were lined in a polished cotton, which is something we don't really see coming into use until the mid-19th century. So sometime beyond the mid-19th century is when these breeches were relined or worn at some point, probably with the coat.
I think you have images of that as well.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So working with historic textiles, you get the incredibly rare opportunity to get up close and personal with history, see things no one else sees, stories in the stitches, little inconsistencies and accommodations in handmade garments. Do you want to talk about, we discussed the pants already, but is there anywhere else where you found these little inconsistencies or accommodations in the Tilghman garment?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are some choices that are like very interesting. Things like so the coat body is made from a material called broadcloth, which is a heavily fulled woolen fabric. It's like midnight blue. I mean, it's really dark blue, but for some reason, the tailor worked the buttonholes in this sort of light blue on the pocket flaps and on the center back vent of the coat. It doesn't appear that these buttonholes have faded over time. That's certainly one place that I've always jumped to, because of extensive
because of light. Sure.
Yeah, sure.
But
it's so even. It just seems that they are worked in this sort of lighter blue color. So just kind of interesting that choice was made. Why? Don't know. And other things too that you can also tell, sort of the order of construction on things was very interesting. For example, you could tell that the pocket flaps were made up by somebody who was working the buttonholes into the wool exterior of it, and then another person lined it, and then it seems perhaps yet another hand cut the buttonholes to then split the lining to allow the buttons to go through. So it's interesting to see, you can begin to suss out a little bit of how these things were put together by the order of construction.
Sure. We're talking a lot about the uniform. Do you want to pull up your slides and show everyone sort of some of the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, let me.
Interested to see these in the seams images.
All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Absolutely.
All right. So what are we looking at here?
So I just have a few images here. I just thought I would share with everybody. This is the basically the base of the throat you're looking at right now. And kind of encapsulates all of the different materials that you find in the Tilghman uniform. So you have this great twilled worsted wool lining, which is oftentimes called shalloon in the period. You can see the buff, really pale buff color of the facings of the collar and of the lapels that go up the center front. And just a little bit, and you'll see some more of the blue here, the dark blue here in a second. But one of the things that's just amazing that this uniform survives is the fact that it's made out of wool. We can see a little bit of mothing in here, but this tends to be like a Thanksgiving feast for webbing clothes moths and carpet beetles. They love to graze and eat off of these protein fibers. So it's really amazing that this uniform has survived largely intact for 200 and almost 250 years. So just a few things to look at there. The big iron piece there in the middle is a hook and eye, and that would have closed the coat down the center front. Top of the lapel has these great winged lapels, and one of the things that gets me every time with this uniform is the quality of the stitching, and it's just unbelievably stitched. Really fine sewing in this uniform. You're probably looking at 15 to 18 stitches per the inch.
That's what I was going to ask. It's like, what are stitches per inch on this bad boy? Because again, it's entirely hand done.
On this top stitching here, just amazingly done. And it's like that throughout it, which is really interesting. So here's the back side of the lapel, and it's kind of interesting because it does create this sort of piping effect, and we do see this on a couple of the uniforms of Washington's generals. Lafayette is painted several times with this sort of piping effect on his uniform, where the blue is sort of undercut from the buff, so you get this kind of striped effect if the coat was, let's say, unbuttoned and pulled across the chest. Don't know if Tilghman ever did it. Washington's portraited doing it all the time, but and it's practical. It's supposed to keep you warm. So it's hard to say if Tilghman ever did it. The other thing to note too, and we'll get back to it just here in a second, is all of the buttons from my first look are replaced. So somebody came in and harvested all but what we know now is, I think, 2 buttons on this uniform, and I've got a few images of those in just here in a second. So don't know where.
Why would someone harvest buttons? Is it for resale, or is it for, this is a monument, like a little token from the Revolutionary War? Both.
I think, well, it could be both, but I think in this case, it's a souvenir item. It's a very easy item to souvenir, and we see this with lots of stuff, particularly with individuals who held sort of high-ranking positions in early America. Things got cut up and sort of given out to family members. And Tilghman, I think, has 2 daughters. So these pieces, and
he had a ton of siblings as well. So
he did, right.
Quite prolific.
So I think things kind of disseminated down different lines in order to get where they're at now.
I gotcha.
Talking about those light blue buttonholes, you can see them here. So in this case, you don't get it on the original because the buttons are missing, but the buttonholes on the far corners on either side, they're open and worked, so you can actually put the buttons through them. Whereas the center buttonhole is non-functional, the button sits below it. So you get a better idea of what those buttons would have looked like when it was actually functioning as a uniform. And another thing is kind of interesting, and it's one of these things that we start to see transitioning, and it was nice to see it this early. Potentially this uniform was made in 1780, 1781, was that the center back of the uniform was cut in one piece on the lining. Very unusual. It's kind of a waste of fabric to do it that way, if you ask me. But it is a trend that you start seeing in the 1780s for menswear, that the backs of these waistcoats start to be, or backs of coats and waistcoats start to be cut in one piece, and they're just fitted with like a tuck. And so that's what you see
interesting
here.
So that's like a tailoring mechanism, a way to fit better.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's necessarily to fit better. It's just another way that they started doing it.
I gotcha.
Yeah, it's not something you see very early on in the 18th century, but definitely in the 1780s and 90s, we start seeing it more and more. So it was interesting to see this in the lining of the coat, because the coat back itself is cut in two pieces, like you would expect. Kind of fun to see here too, the reverse side of the pocket. So the pocket flap itself was made up. The buttonholes were stitched through that and what's known as buckram, which is a stiffened linen. And then the pocket flap was lined. And so the problem is that now you've basically closed up your working buttonhole. And so you see this frequently where they then slice through the lining and they kind of whip it down. And that's what you see in those blue stitches right there. But the blue stitches are a repair from, don't know when, but the other three on the garment are all done in buff colored, the sort of matching colored silk. So just interesting, again, an order and operation that is nice to document. And a lot more of the replaced buttons here.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear things like that. Where like, well, they did this and then couldn't use the buttons, so they had to slice it.
Well, sometimes they may have had
only get to experience when you're doing this, closing.
Yeah, so if you have a bunch of people in the shop, buttonholes take time, and so you can hand this stuff off, and then give the slicing of the buttonholes in the back of it to an apprentice, because it's not very skilled work to do that. So
sure.
So here we see Allison was very kind to lend me a mannequin so we could put the coat on it, and you can see the coat on the mannequin itself. And what's really interesting, and I always find curious, is this very strange collar. It wasn't until I went looking later that I was like, oh, this actually is a thing. Where the wing lapel, the wing that goes up onto the collar itself, is narrower than the actual collar, and it kind of peeks out. But
it's like the intentional piping you showed on the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
Overlap.
And so if we go to our portraits of Washington and his generals here, this was done in, I think, 1784 by Charles Wilson Peale. You notice that right on Tilghman's uniform coat. He has
for the uninitiated, this very famous portrait, you see Tench Tilghman on the far right holding the Articles of Capitulation, because again, he's given that honor to announce the end of the Revolutionary War. Just a sidebar. Sorry.
Now, but what is interesting though, and always makes me wonder, is that the skirt of this coat, however, if you look at it, and not to get on a sidebar here as well, but it does not match the style of the coat that survives. So the collar and the lapels do, they match fine. The epaulettes don't match the ones that survive. And the sort of vertical buttons going down into the skirt, if you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, is not how Tilghman's coat that survives is set up. So he may have had another coat that perhaps he stood for this portrait. It's hard to say, but maybe Charles Wilson Peale is just trying to make things a little bit more interesting instead of another just blue and buff coat. Hard to say, but worth pointing out for those of us who are interested in those details. And just for another close-up look, you can see the collar there on the left and on the right in the portrait. Just a couple quick images here. I'll go because I know we have about a half an hour and there's lots of questions coming in. But here are the breeches that survive. Really nice example of breeches from the period. You could see that really wide splay of the breeches, which is fairly typical for the period, which gives you sort of maneuverability. Because if you don't have that splay, you really lose a lot of that sort of lateral movement that we get in, let's say, loose fitted trousers in the 21st century. Because there's garters that fasten this garment below your knees. There's not much movement in the garment itself proper. Again, in this garment, all the buttons seem to have been replaced at one point. Don't know if they match the coat buttons, and we'll talk about that in just a brief second.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike most broadcloth garments, all the edges on this garment are turned. This is not typical for broadcloth. I don't think I've seen another pair of breeches done like this. It may be because the broadcloth is so thin, and the tailor decided to turn those edges to make sure they're going to wear very well. So an interesting tailoring choice there for the person who is actually putting this together. So you can see on your screen here, the flap, or what we might call the fall, all those edges are turned, the pockets are all turned, the waistband is all turned. Typically on surviving broadcloth breeches, this would have been left raw because the fabric is so densely fulled, it holds a raw edge. It doesn't unravel.
And that's quicker than having to do a turned edge.
Absolutely. And here you can see that polished cotton that I was talking about that now line the legs of the breeches. These sort of lighter colored, kind of stripy linen that's in there is original. So that's what the original tailor had put in there. My guess is that somebody in 1850, let's say, didn't want to deal with scratchy breeches. So
that sounds about right. I believe this came through the Tilghman family. So,
so they probably slip this cotton lining into it to make it a little bit more comfortable, because they are unlined. The breeches themselves, originally they were completely unlined. So they're very thin, very, very, very thin, which is again another interesting choice for
a uniform.
For a uniform, right? Just some details of the inside. You can see that full shiny cotton lining in it. This is the lining of the waistband. It's that sort of same sort of striated linen. You're looking at the bottom of the pocket bag for what was known as the fob, and that's the pocket that the watch sits in. So something that would have been very important for Tilghman, keeping time for Washington.
Absolutely.
Pockets were also realigned. I just wanted to show, I just threw this photo in here too. Kind of a finicky thing to do, but the pockets must have worn out on Tilghman at some point. You can see that there's a lot of wear in them. And so it either maybe during Tilghman's lifetime or maybe later in the 19th century, it's hard to say, but the pockets were remade essentially. Kind of an interesting thing.
So what are we looking at the tip here? Is that a buttonhole? It looks like someone's darned or done some adjustment there.
Yeah, so what's happened is, so the top there is the original pocket bag, and there's a buttonhole. That's the opening from the front of the pocket.
I gotcha.
We're kind of like looking down into it at this point. And then the sort of tannish color where you see that dark stitching at there, that's the replacement bag. So somebody which is really cool because they left the original bag in there. They just sort of inset the new bag over top of it. So it really did preserve the antique.
I was going to say, so inevitably they preserved the original, but also gave themselves a working pocket.
Right. Okay, so the buttons. So this is
I gotta tell you, the buttons, like when we got the repro back, that was one thing you're like, are these the same buttons? And I was like, that's an interesting story. So tell us about the buttons and how the two surviving buttons.
So the coat that is at the the American Center for Culture has two buttons on it that I was like, these are kind of period looking. And so I didn't know. At that point, my guess was that I was going to put just plain gilt buttons on it, as Tilghman had in the portraits that show. But it wasn't until I had a lecture at the Society of Cincinnati in Washington, D.C., where I stumbled upon these buttons, which, if we go back, just take a quick peek at this
Separate
one.
side.
So there's two buttons that survive. They're both on the top lapel, where the wing is. And then this one, these two survive at the Society of Cincinnati. And you can see the back there, it reads, Lieutenant Colonel Tench Tilghman, aide to Washington. So they have two of these, and these are on cards that survive at the Society, and sort of sealed the deal that, okay, the two buttons that are on the coat at in Maryland are actually real. And these are two others. So there's, who knows, 40 more somewhere else.
I was going to ask, how many are on the full?
I think it's 38 total, if I remember correctly off the top of my head.
That sounds about right.
Now, what is interesting, and it still is confusing to me, is the ones on your coat are studs like this one. So they have a button back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Not generally how buttons are done in the 18th century for a man's coat.
Really?
The two that are at Cincinnati are also studs. So I don't know if some point somebody soldered studs onto them for reuse somewhere else to engrave them like you see here. I still have not completely figured that one out 100%. But all the ones that do survive are all studs. They don't have loops on the back to sew them on. They're meant to go through another buttonhole essentially.
Yeah, you mentioned this is not typically done. The way that was typically done is
so it usually has a loop in the back, and then a piece of tape or a piece of leather is strung through it to make the buttons lay like really flat against the surface of the coat. That's how I would expect to see them on a period coat, and pretty much all the ones that I've seen are done that way. So that was exciting. So we were able to reproduce them as close as we could get them. They're still not 100% perfect. It doesn't have the sort of engine turned. You can see on the left here, almost looks like a thumbprint in the middle. It doesn't have that. We just did, time, expense. The project was dragging on at that point. So, but nonetheless, we do have fairly good reproductions on.
They're really good.
Yeah, they look
the
cool.
Original.
So the Society of Cincinnati also has the epaulettes that were probably worn with the Maryland uniform as well. Now, it's worth noting here that they are missing the blue under epaulette. So there would have been a blue piece that slid underneath of the epaulette to allow it to actually fix onto the shoulder of, keep it on the shoulder from moving around when you're actually wearing it. You can see they're marked TT, probably for Tench Tilghman, probably done by his hand. So this stuff isn't getting mixed up with the rest of Washington's family, because they're all wearing blue and buff.
Sure.
But your coat seems to have the blue under epaulettes.
So we've got half of the equation.
So you can barely see them, but they are a slightly lighter blue.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks as if they were just simply cut off on the coat themselves and somebody then took them. So you do have half of those epaulettes that survive from Tench Tilghman.
That's amazing. Thank you for showing us those amazing close-up images.
Sure.
It's so cool to learn more and more about this object. I have more questions for you, but
sure.
We're also 20 minutes from the end. So I'm going to go to let the audience ask their questions, because Great. I can always email you. So one question we have is, are the buff flares raw edge in the finished original?
Great question. And so, as I said, on the coat, everything except for the cuffs are raw edged. The cuffs are turned, and this is typical for most broadcloth coats that survive from the 18th century. They still tend to turn the top edge of the cuff, probably because it gets a lot of wear. So on the coat, everything is raw edge except for the cuffs and the breeches. Everything is turned, which is unusual.
Yeah, which we dove into a little bit. Okay, thank you so much for the intimate tour of this wonderful garment. Is it ever possible to determine from details or techniques whether a particular person made a surviving garment?
It's hard, I don't know much about the Tilghman family papers, if much survives from them. But it might be possible to document when that uniform was made. We have a great end date. We know it could not be made after 1786 for sure.
Sure.
It'll be a matter of taking some time to dive into figuring out who actually made it from any papers that might survive from him. For example, Washington, we know exactly who's making the majority of his uniforms, but he was pretty fastidious in saving his paperwork. Not always the case for everybody, though. A little tiny receipt for a uniform coat may not be as important as something else.
Which is a shame because we're sitting here talking about how wonderfully hand stitched it is and the number of stitches in there, and the maker is often lost.
Very anonymous, oftentimes. Yep.
Yeah. Question: have you ever attempted to reconstruct a historic garment from an image or other records when patterning an existing costume is not possible?
Absolutely. And, that's something else that I do quite frequently, particularly making clothing for enslaved individuals. So I've made a number of coats to represent some of Washington's enslaved servants, namely Billy Lee and a few others. And Washington, again, being the way he is, he gives us great descriptions of what certain things are supposed to look like. And so we're able to then either use a period pattern from another garment and then use a description to kind of fill in what it's supposed to look like. Washington always describes his livery coats as not quite white. And so you can figure that it's not a bright white, but maybe a light, a slightly drab color. And in 1760, I think it's 64 or 68, he has a great description of how his livery is supposed to look like. Cuffs up to the elbows, where the lace is supposed to be. And so I was able to recreate that piece then for Mount Vernon. It's certainly very common for, because not everything survives, unfortunately.
Right. And you have to depend on that archival minutia in the details, because as you said, there's so many little details that go into recreating something. So thank goodness he was so thorough in his descriptions.
Well, and too, for Tench, we don't have a waistcoat for him. So we had to use what we knew about his body shape and size off the coat in order to make a waistcoat to fit underneath the coat. So, we know that we have Washington's small clothes from the Revolutionary War. Plus we have portraiture showing what they were wearing. And it's, fairly conservative dress, very typical 1770s, 1780s waistcoats. So, we can make really good informed decisions on how these things were made based off of other surviving examples, portraiture, written documents, whatever it might be.
Okay, you mentioned we can't find fabrics today that match the 18th century fabrics. What is unique about 18th century fabrics that they can't be duplicated today? You dove into that a little bit.
Yeah, they can be duplicated, and we have individuals who are making them. It's just hard to find, or it's extremely expensive. And a lot of it is driven due to the current fashion industries. We don't tend to wear a lot of wool anymore in the 21st century. It was a staple. It was the backbone of the English economy in the 18th and early 19th century. And so the sort of the know-how and all that technical expertise of not only the husbandry of raising the sheep, but blending those fibers together, spinning them, weaving them, and then all the finishing processes that are needed to get that sort of desirable finish. It kind of wanes going through, as society wants different types of textiles.
Sure.
These things are lost or changed over time. So it's not that we can't do it. It's just that it's not desirable, and it's just not something that as a society today we have a demand for. So it's harder for us to find them. We can find things that are fairly good that look fairly close. But trying to find what, like a super fine broadcloth, it's the thinness of it, but yet the density of it, it's just so hard to find. We just don't make cloth like that any longer.
Right. And I think technology as part of that is processes change. And
Sure.
so finding contemporary fabrics that replicate historic fabrics can be quite a challenge.
Yeah, and just because it's mechanized doesn't necessarily mean it's better. So,
Right, exactly.
so you do lose something when something's being produced by hand versus by machine.
We just mentioned broadcloth, and there's a couple of questions about terminology. Could you just define broadcloth as compared
Absolutely.
to fabrics?
Sure. Broadcloth in the 18th century is a heavily fulled woolen. Most of us today would think of broadcloth as a shirting material that's typically cotton, but the 18th century man or woman would understand it as a very, very heavily fulled. So we might call it felted, but technically a felt doesn't have a woven structure underneath of it. So what they're doing is they're weaving the fabric itself, and then they're able to pull a nap up onto it and press it back down to make it look like a felted surface, even though it's a woven structure underneath of it.
Thank you. That was the best definition of broadcloth I've heard. Thank you for your perfect answer. Someone asked, are the construction stitches done in a stab stitch or a back stitch?
Back stitch, yeah. So all of your seaming stitches, the side seams, the center back seam, those are all done in back stitch. So stabbing is there was stabbing done in this garment, in particularly when they stack up all the layers of the pleats. I mean, it's just like 2 inches thick. So, they're stabbing through that, but they're not going to stab and take that time. It would take you forever. So it's just backstitch and fairly coarse, not very fine.
Let's see.
Lots of technical questions.
I know there are. Were the buttonholes machine made?
They are not. No, there's no method of doing machine buttonholes until well into the 19th century. So all the buttonholes, and there are a ton on the Tilghman uniform, they're all done by hand and all worked in silk.
We do have a lot of technical questions. Was all of the cloth for the uniform produced in North America or imported?
That's a great question. My guess is that it's probably ironically English.
Yeah. I was say, ironically, because we were fighting them.
There's a possibility it could be French, but I don't think that in 1780 or 81 we have the capability of producing that quality of cloth in the United States at that point. We'll get there, but it's probably either going to be English or French cloth.
And somebody asked a similar question, the provenance for the materials that make up the uniform, would they all have been imported? Were there any parts of it that might have been locally sourced, buttons and things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. The buttons, it's a possibility, but again, Birmingham has kind of centered the market on that. Even though we're not trading with England properly, things are still getting here, legally or illegally. Of course, by 1780, 81, there's Tilghman and Lafayette are probably pretty tight, friend-wise, because they're working in the same, family as Washington. So, and Lafayette coming back from France and providing all these materials to supply the light infantry corps. I wonder if possibly Lafayette brought materials back for Tilghman and other members of the family, maybe even Washington, to have new uniforms made, because it's fabric wise it's getting scarce, even by 76 it's really scarce. To keep an army in the field, it's not easy.
Many extant coats are long and thin. Is this typical of military coats in particular or society at large? Yeah,
that's a great question. In terms of military coats, they tend to be long. While that's not very practical, the officers tend to oftentimes, at least in the American Army, wear longer styled coats, down to the back of the knee pan or so. But that's also the societal norm. That's where most men's coats are being worn at that point in time. Though we do find it some more practicality with enlisted coats being chopped down into shorter coats, and even some of the officers doing that as well. not only practical for the wearer, but it also saves a huge amount of fabric. Again, going back to that need of having materials to clothe the army. So even though you're losing a few inches, that few inches adds up over a couple hundred men.
Sure, especially as you say, when you're clothing an army.
Yep.
What is the earliest garment that you've worked on?
I've had a really great opportunity to study several of the 17th and 16th century doublets that are owned by the Victorian Albert Museum in London.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really amazing to study those pieces. It's hard to believe that you're looking at a garment that's 400 to 420 years old. So really, very, very lucky to be able to study those garments. So we reproduced a doublet and a pair of breeches for Virginia's 400th anniversary in 2007. And so we had a great study trip to go to England and study those pieces before we made those reproductions.
I'm so jealous. I would love to go into the collection storage at the Victorian Albert Museum. That must have been just like an amazing experience.
It's crazy. There's I forget how many objects they have, but it's in the tens of thousands, if not even more. Because they collect up to the modern day. So it's not just a historic collection like we are.
What dyes are used specifically when we're talking about that dark blue fabric?
The dark blue, more than anything, is probably going to be indigo. Again, ironically, the indigo may have been grown and harvested in the Southern American colonies and shipped over to Europe or to England to then be dyed. So indigo for the dark blue, and the light blue, or the buff, could be a variety of different yellows. Fustic weld is another one that they're using to get that, but it's a fairly pale buff color that faces the uniform and lines it too.
Were British uniforms at the same time period essentially made using similar or the same sewing techniques, like technology?
Yeah, same thing. Prior to 1776, we're British, so for the most part.
That's a good point.
So our tailoring techniques primarily are following what the British tailoring techniques are of the period. So certainly, cut and style wise, obviously, the British Army is far more regulated. The American Army is just trying to get clothes on their backs. Whatever they can get, they can get.
So we have a couple of questions about the buttons. Would the studs be connected with an eyelet hole or the buttonhole that you had mentioned?
Well, so that's the question. I don't know if the studs were meant to be on the uniform to begin with. They may have been added later for something else that I don't know what. Though the two that are on your coat in your collection, they are going through the collar. So there's another buttonhole up on the collar itself. So the stud is going through the lapel that comes up, and then underneath that through the collar. So that kind of makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah.
But it just kind of flaps around, like there's nothing to keep it in place. So I don't know if the studs are original. I want to say they're not, but I don't want to be 100% on that just yet.
Right. And you said the coat, you were saying like 1780s is about right. Tench Tilghman takes a break from the war, I believe in 82. Yep. And that's, he's battling, I believe it's an illness. And he also takes time off to court his cousin, who becomes his wife. So there is that time period where he's not at war in the 1780s. Someone also asked, could studs be mounted over the button loops?
Yeah, it's possible, but like I said, I'm still,
it's a mystery still.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that we now have 4. So the question is, maybe they were all taken off at one point, and then studs put on all of them,
right?
Or something. Who knows?
Somebody asked, and I'm pretty sure the answer. I know the answer to this, but you saw the TT on the epaulettes at the Society of Cincinnati and the name on the back of the buttons. Was there any personal markings or identification on the uniform itself?
Not that I can remember off the top of my head.
I don't remember any either.
I was all over it, so I didn't see anything in there. In this case, it's family history descending to your
through
collection.
The family.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Somebody, and I know that you went into this a bit, discuss tracing an original garment for pattern pieces. You talked about this a little bit in the taking something you can't take apart and creating that pattern.
Yeah, so what I tend to use is a variety of different pattern papers that I can lay down and then either with pencil trace onto the paper itself, and then work off of that to develop the other more difficult parts, like the arm's eye, which is really the most difficult part, quite honestly. But I also tend to use some heavy mylar that I'll lay over certain areas, like the pocket flap, to get and trace it in order to get a exact replica of that shape of pocket flap. They tend to be very difficult to, sort of measure for, to get those exact curve shapes. So
because I mean, they're not machine made, they're not machine cut. So it's are they asymmetrical in this coat? Is that correct? I feel like I remember you in your blog, or they were just a little imperfect.
Yeah, I think one side was a little higher than the other, but it happens. So there's a variety of tracing that I can do in certain areas, and it's just a tremendous amount of measuring. Taking measurements off of every seam possible to make sure we have the closest shape. I hope to get within a half an inch on all sides of that garment to the original. It's probably not going to be 100%, but it's going to be pretty darn close.
Yeah, having seen both, it's pretty darn close.
Well, thank you.
Somebody has a question. They say they're newbie. So they wanted to know, when you were talking about the back of the coat, the very end of the coat, the button back portions, I think you called them a skirt, which I believe you did, the skirt of the coat. What is the purpose for the buttons and for those ends? Would they be fastened? Is the purpose for the ends of those coats to be fastened or to lay flat?
Yeah, that's a good question. So interestingly enough, Tilghman's coat does turn back. So the skirts themselves actually fold back and they meet. It's just merely style, more than anything. There is one interesting thing that I did find. There is a little, what they call a worm or a tack, that is placed in sort of in the lower half of the coat skirt to make you think that just the front may have turned back. Now, I've not seen this terribly often on any other military coat from the period, and I'm sure there's plenty of guys out there screaming at me through their screens right now, but so is it done in the period? It was maybe done in the period. It may have been done by somebody who didn't know what to do. Like they realized that there's a hook on the front of the coat, so it needs to hook to something. So it's hard to say. Some of the American coats that survive do have hearts where they meet at the back as well. Some have diamonds. Other have branches of service like the French Army. So the coat skirts do turn back. But if you're talking about, let's say, a civilian coat, like another coat that Tench would have worn, they don't turn back. That's certainly a strictly military thing.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions and we're at our 1 hour mark. So I think what we will do is we will look at these questions and perhaps we'll do one more, and then maybe you could answer them and we can send them by email.
Sure. Absolutely.
Why do you think the waistcoat is missing in this uniform?
That's a great question.
My guess about it being a tasty treat for insects, but the pants survive.
That's true. I wouldn't be surprised if it was picked up by somebody as a family member or something as a souvenir, something like that. It's small. It could be framed. There's lots of things that could have happened to it over the course of its existence. And like I said, it may still survive today. It still may be within Tilghman family.
It's possible, yeah.
So it's always surprising where these things turn up at. When I was a curator at the Museum of the American Revolution, of course, they have the first Oval Office, the Washington's war tent, and there's a big hole cut out of the ceiling of it. Don't know why. At that point, we weren't sure who did it, but it turns out that the whole that piece survives. And I believe it was at Harvard, and it's on loan back to the museum. But it's interesting that piece does survive, even though it was missing from it for however many years.
If we've learned anything it is that document everything, just write it down, because it will be a mystery to someone. It could just be like you needed to take something off, like just with everyday life. It's just, I always find mysteries and I'm like, why was this done this way? Without that documentation, the knowledge gets lost and we're just left to wonder, but maybe mystery is good.
Well, I wanted to thank you both, Allison and Neal, for this fantastic conversation in regards to Tench Tilghman and the coat. We have had lots of activity in the chat and lots of questions and most answered, actually. So you did a fabulous job. Allison, look out for an email this afternoon that will include some additional information. And again, some of the links that were provided in the chat. And we will see you next spring for our next FSK from home. Thank you so much all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.